Avatar! Know that Britannia has entered into a new age of enlightenment. Know that the time has finally come for the one true Lord of Britannia to take his place at the head of his people. Under my guidance, Britannia will flourish, and all of the people shall rejoice and pay homage to their new guardian. Know that you too shall kneel before me, Avatar. You too will soon acknowledge my authority, for I shall be your companion, your provider, and your master.
All right, I figured it was time for a little change of pace, so what you just saw was the introduction to the first part of Ultima 7. The Black Gate and the Forge of Virtue was an add-on disc that you could get for the game. So, we've talked about Ultimas 4 through 6. This is Ultima 7. This is another one of those ones where when I was a little kid, it was just a little bit too complicated for me to finish the thing. So I've never actually finished the thing in its entirety. In fact, a few years ago, I tried to finish the whole thing in its entirety, and I got stuck in some kind of weird glitch right near the end of the game, where it was like, where a literal window would pop up and say, something has gone wrong with your game, and you're going to have to go try to find like an earlier save. And I didn't have any really good earlier saves that weren't way, way back in the middle of nowhere. So I kind of set that aside, and I haven't played it that much since. So we're going to be going a little bit from memory in this case, but I did kind of play the intro, and we've got some screenshots and stuff that you guys should like. But first, let's talk about that intro. Okay. The best parts of the Ultima intros, or the best strategy that the Ultima intros have had, is to address the player directly. And this one does it in spades. We have a mysterious character coming out of the screen and ranting at you for a few minutes before vanishing in hilarious laughter. By the way, props to Bill Johnson, I believe, who did the voice for the Guardian in 7, 8, and 9, I believe. I just looked this up, but and my source is the Ultima Codex, so I haven't really dug too deeply into this to confirm it. But apparently they had tried to get Michael Dorn, or they had Michael Dorn, Worf from Star Trek: The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, and a couple of movies, do the voice of the Guardian for 9, and then they were like, nah, let's bring back Bill Johnson. So he voiced it in all 3 games, and in Ultima Underworld 2, which is not going to be part of the series because I have not played either of the Underworld games sufficiently enough to really have a good feel for them, but maybe I will someday. Anyway, so this intro is great. It's directed at the player, and what it does is something, it's short and sweet, so much so that I was comfortable just putting it at the start of this video. But here's the thing that it does that Ultima hadn't done for years. It introduces an antagonist, ? Because the Guardian is not entirely obviously evil at first glance. I mean, you're like, well, he's probably the bad guy, but at the same time, he says your companion, your provider, and then he comes out with your master, right? It's a great little trick because it implies to you at the start of the game already that on some level you're going to end up working with this entity, this Guardian, and it also implies that he's been doing a lot of work in Britannia while you've been gone. And so things have changed in your absence is basically what we're getting at. So after you see that intro, you create your character, which is basically name and sex, right? And you basically get dropped into Trinsic. And who should be there but our good friend Iolo. Again, this is a great technique, a great writing technique for a sequel, is to draw the player in with a reference to a well-known and well-loved character. Everybody loves Iolo. So Iolo gives us a little bit of exposition, not too much. He mentions two things. Number one, that it's been 200 Britannian years since you last visited, which is strange because, like, between Ultima 4 and 5, it was not very long. Between Ultimas 5 and 6, it was not very long. In the real world, it was a couple of years, but and it's the same kind of couple of years in the real world between 6 and 7. But according to Iolo, it's been 200 Britannian years since you left at the end of Ultima 6. He also gives you this little what would you call it? Like a teaser that like magic is dying, which is true in multiple ways in Ultima 7, which we'll get to in a minute. But the cool thing about the start of Ultima 7 is that it doesn't bring you in combat or with some kind of desperate plea to save the world, or some great evil manifesting itself and throwing a lightning bolt at Shamino or anything like that. No. You start out dropped right into the middle of a murder mystery. and this is one of the cool things about Ultima 7, is that despite some of the lackluster aspects of the gameplay, people remember this game, and they really remember it fondly because it has one of the more interesting, intricate, twisty-turvy, mysterious plots of the Ultima series. So, basically what happens is that the mayor of Trinsic walks up. He's like, "Can you go investigate this murder scene?" It's like, I know you just got here, but anyway. So, you go and visit the murder scene. You find a man who's been the victim of some kind of horrifying ritual, something dark and indescribable. You find a poor wingless gargoyle who is apparently like a collateral damage, I guess. You find footprints in blood leading out of the stables where the murder occurred. And on the body of the dead man, you find a key. Now, if you talk to the mayor, he'll tell you, "Oh, you found a key," or he'll ask you what you found, and you say, "I found a key," and he'll say, "Oh, you should go talk to the child of Christopher, who was the murder victim." And the child is named Spark. He lives in his house with his father. Now he's an orphan. You go visit Spark. There's a great little point of humor where Spark is trying to convince you to let him join the party, and Iolo's like, "I don't know," and Spark basically uses his sling and he knocks a fly out of the sky, out of the air around Iolo, and it's a pretty funny little scene there. But inside Spark's house, you find a chest, and the key that you found on Christopher's body opens the chest. Inside there, you find some gold, you find a fellowship medallion, and you find a suspicious scroll. Now, Spark doesn't know what the scroll's about, but he knows that his father had a job from somebody a while ago. He's like, "Well, let's go check out the smithy, right?" You get there, the door is busted open, and as you walk in, you get to hear a little voice clip of the Guardian laughing, evilly in the sky. There's not really anything special inside, and the door's been busted down, so you kind of are like, well, whatever was here, it's gone now, I guess. But this is kind of where you start to learn about the Fellowship as well. The Fellowship is an organization that has appeared in the preceding, 200 years of your absence, that is now putting forth this new philosophy. I'll spare you the extent of it, but it basically goes off of three tenets. You'll see them up here on the screen here, and the point that we're going to get to in this game, I'm going to try to spoil less of this than I did in the earlier games, because you really should try this game out. But one of them is worthiness precedes reward, which sounds reasonable, right? Like, you shouldn't expect to get rewarded until you do something that makes you worthy of that reward. It's basic causality. But if you talk to the Fellowship people who are, running the Fellowship branch intrinsic, you find out that it's so you get a little hint of how easy it is to corrupt these kind of lofty but vague tenets. Basically, when you talk to Clog, who is the branch leader, you mentioned he basically says, "Oh man, if Christopher was killed, it must mean that he's done something bad in order to deserve that." Ooh, that's a nice little twist on worthiness precedes reward, isn't it? And throughout the game, you're going to find out more about the Fellowship and the mix of positive and negative effects it's had on Britannia in your absence. So the investigation, nevertheless, the investigation continues, and you talk to the guard who was knocked out when from behind by possibly the murderer or murderers. You find out that there was a ship called the Crown Jewel that was slated to head out for Britannia for Britain in the morning, and it left on the morning tide. And so, after you go around the town and you talk to a bunch of people and you confirm a bunch of details, for instance, you can even go to the shipwright and say, "Hey, do you have a schedule of what ship left here this morning?" And he'll confirm to you, "Yeah, it was the Crown Jewel, and they left this morning." At that point, you basically have to go to the mayor of Trinsic and give him a report. And I'm going to show just kind of some of the questions that he asks for your report. It's simple stuff, but it's a nice start to a game that's about kind of adventure, where they're starting you out with a little bit of like a brain teaser. Not teaser necessarily, but it's like, can you arrange these facts in your head and remember them in some way, whether with a notebook or just in your memory? And can you recite them back to a person to give him a report? And talking to him and giving him that report is what has him let you out of the city of Trinsic, so that you can pursue this hook-handed guy toward Britain. And at that point, the game kind of opens up, and it's kind of an open world game. Honestly, there's no major barriers. There's a few here and there for things where you're going to need to get A before you can enter B, stuff like that. But in general, you can kind of just wander around Britannia, and be careful if you do, because there are actually some game-breaking bugs that you can cause if you do that necessarily. But there's lots of places to explore. There's tons of character interactions. And there's even kind of this pretty cool mystery that ends up getting investigated. And then, it ends up that there's like a plot where you're investigating the murderers, and then there's a B plot where you get kind of a clue about the murders that leads you off in another direction kind of thing. And so it's not even a very linear story in that sense. Like, you can miss the clue, or you can fail to follow up on the clue that leads you to the keys that you need to finish the game, and just keep exploring the murders and keep exploring the world. There's plenty of places to go. There's plenty of fun characters to interact with. You get to learn if you go to the castle of Lord British. You can talk to Lord British. You can also talk to Chuckles, the jester, and he has a fun little game that you can play with him. That's kind of fun to figure out. I'm trying not to spoil things in a big way, but as you've probably guessed, the Fellowship and the Guardian are connected in some ways, and part of the fun of this game is all of the kind of detective work that you end up doing to make the connections and figure out who's the mastermind, who's doing what, who knows what kind of thing going on throughout the game. There's also there was an add-on disc called the Forge of Virtue, which you have to do some side quest stuff for that too. So Ultima 7 is also an interesting game in the sense that it came in two and technically 4 parts, because there's part 1, and then there's the DLC, what we would call today DLC for part 1, the Forge of Virtue, and then there's part 2, the Serpent Isle, and the DLC for that, the Silver Seed. Again, to kind of minimize spoilers, part 2 opens again in a very interesting way. And by the way, apparently the occurrences of Ultima Underworld 2 happened between Ultima 7 Part 1 and Ultima 7 Part 2, or is it between 7 Part 2 and 8? I'm not sure, but Ultima Underworld 2 is in there somewhere. Anyway, so without spoiling anything too much, you thwart the designs of the bad guys in Ultima 7 Part 1. You force him on the run, and you've got him. You're chasing him. And Ultima 7 Part 2 starts with Lord British opening a scroll, and the scroll pops up like a video of the Guardian giving orders to one of his underlings. And those orders are to go to the Serpent Isle. Now, this is a cool other thing, too, because after Ultima 4, we haven't heard much about Ultimas 1 through 3, right? In Ultimas 1 through 3, the world that you were in was called Sosaria, which I always thought was kind of a funny sounding name, like so sorry. But but it turns out that the rest of Sosaria that didn't show up in Ultima 4 Plus didn't go away. What happens is that they kind of like somehow magically lock themselves in like a separate space, and so you basically have to sail through these serpent pillars, and that teleports you into the world of what's left of Sosaria. So at this point, the island that makes up the majority of Sosaria's landmass is called the Serpent Isle. You go there, and again, this is another fun one. It's not quite as gripping as the intro to Ultima 7, but from a writing perspective, it does a different thing. Again, it's nice to switch things up. We've had, you at a computer, and you knock on the side of it because something's wrong. Well, you're still in Britannia at the end of Ultima 7 Part 1, so let's have you be doing something to save Britannia, right? And so, what's kind of cool about this is that you start out and you're decked out like crazy. You've got all this good equipment, you've got all these magical weapons and armor, you've got your companions with you, Iolo, Shimino, and Dupre. You're taking a well outfitted ship through the serpent between the Serpent Towers to the Serpent Isle. You get there though, and you're decked out. You got everything you need to wallop on the bad guys as much as you can. And as you walk away from your ship, which landed on dry land somehow, right? It's like we were flying, but then suddenly you're on dry land in a ship that can't go anywhere now. This lightning comes out of nowhere, and your companions freak out and disappear, which is fun. It's a good way to kind of. There's a lot of games that start you out like right after the following action of the previous game, and you always have to explain why Samus Aran doesn't have all of her weapons again, kind of thing, right? In this, what happens is that you go through the storm, and the lightning teleports your people, your friends, and your equipment away from you. And you also end up talking to this monk who claims that they're like there to help you, and then another monk claims and pops up and says, "You've doomed us all by talking to the Avatar directly," and they have a fight, and it's all really cool and fun stuff. But basically, what the game has done is in a very short period of time, it said, "Okay, here you are. Here's your motivation. Number one, get your stuff back." Right? Like I really liked that sword. I want that back. Number two, find your friends, right? Because not just because the monk says go find your friends, but because they're your friends and you want to make sure that they don't, get lost in this world any more than you do, right? There's some crypticness. There's a little bit of a mystery box. Like, why are these two monks fighting? Why are they saying, why do they give you this stuff? There's also a fun little bit that the monk gives you this hourglass, and she's like, by the way, if any of your companions die, you can revive them with this hourglass. And it's like, so just as a slight aside, the combat in Ultima 7, Part 1 and Part 2 is a little bit ridiculous. Instead of a turn-based system, they went to this bizarre, like, real-time system, and sometimes it just feels completely random. People, you'll go into the same fight against the same things, and everybody will die. Or you'll go through the fight, and everything's going well, and all of a sudden your screen will turn red, and you died. Game over, go back to the Monk Isle, or to Lord British's castle if you're playing the first part. The combat is a little bit off in this game, and thankfully there's not a huge amount of it. Another thing I mentioned earlier about magic dwindling in Britannia, and the fact of the matter is that in these games there's a lot of spells that you can get, but you almost never need to actually use any of them in the game. And so the magic dwindling thing is kind of funny, just as a like a meta thing, right? Like, yeah, magic is dwindling, and we couldn't really think of anything that could make magic useful in combat without possibly nuking your friends. so there you just don't really need to use it that much. But we have a great little intro here for Ultima 7 Part 2 as well. We have motivation for you. Number one, chase down the guy that you almost got in Ultima 7 Part 1. Number two, find your missing belongings, find your friends. Another good one. Number 3, some cryptic monks talking about like the prophecy and blah, 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 blah. Number 3. Number 4, another system of philosophies to create a system of virtues that you have to play around with and, solve puzzles regarding those. What it's trying to do is it's trying to pull you into a new world with new rules. And this new rules point is going to get really important as time goes on, because that's what's going to end up happening later in the series. The world of Britannia was built to exist on this rule set of the 8 virtues, right? And what we're going to find out is that forces outside of Britannia want to convert Britannia into operation on their rules rather than the ones that it currently has. The Serpent Isle also has a different set of rules, and there's even a conflict between different sets of followers of different rules on the Serpent Isle itself. Later on in the series, we'll see even more of that. But this idea of a set of rules being connected to a world and its character is a neat little writing technique that helps to make Ultimas 7 and 8, and even 9, I guess, a little bit interesting from that perspective. Again, in Ultima 7 Part 2, there's lots of characters to talk to. There's a lot of neat interactions to have. There's a lot of cool mysteries to solve. There's a lot of fun negotiations where it's like, well, yeah, I mean, I had a pair of stockings, and I woke up the next morning and there was a giant black sword in my dresser, and I was like, well, this is nicer than the stockings that are missing, so I want to keep this. And so you got to kind of convince people to give you back your stuff sometimes. It's kind of fun. There's a lot of cool puzzles, very hard puzzles in Ultima 7 Part 2, The Serpent Isle. Apparently, you can soft lock yourself in that game a few different ways, and as a little kid, I just did not have the attention span to like focus on that game long enough to get through the whole thing. Going through this series is making me think I want to play Ultimas. I've already beaten 4 and 5 fairly recently, but I could go through them again. But I really want to actually finish 6, actually finish 7, actually finish 8, and actually finish 9, because 9 had problems. We'll get to that later. Anyway. So, in conclusion, what we've got here in Ultima 7, number 1, a familiar hook to start Ultima 7 Part 1. We've got a villain, and a real antagonist this time, who is directly taunting you to get you to come back into Britannia. That's a hook that Ultima hasn't used in a long time. The last time we had a real antagonist to taunt us was Exodus in Ultima 3, right? He was an evil sorcerer creature that you had to kill. So now we've got, we went away from that kind of basic RPG trope of, hero versus villain for 3 games, and now we're back to it. But it's not just, a big dragon that we have to stab at the end of the game. The Guardian is a subtle and interesting villain, where the things that he's doing are not winning people over by not like conquering people by force of arms so much as winning them over through convenient and malleable philosophies. And so we now have a mixing of the system of rules in the world and the antagonist seeking to supplant an old set of rules with a new set of rules. And this leads to a lot of really cool story elements in 7. So much so that despite the gameplay of 7 being a little bit lackluster in a variety of ways, the combat is kind of goofy, the magic is mostly useless, a lot of people still have a really fond memories of this game just because it weaved such an interesting tale. Part 2, the plot is a little bit more nonsensical from what I've read from people saying, yeah, the plot was a little goofy, but there's a lot of cool, interesting characters to interact with. There's a lot of really cool, interesting, difficult puzzles, too, right? Like, nowadays, almost no game, will soft lock you behind a tough puzzle. Like, if I think about, say, any recent RPG, like the things that block you are not generally brain teasers, where it's like I just can't figure this out, and so whatever. It's usually something more like, oh, you can't beat this boss fight, or you can't get. It's very uncommon these days for game developers to put the completion of a game behind just difficult brain teasers, because it locks out a good chunk of the audience, I guess. But that's one of the things that Ultima 7 was not afraid to do, which is also a really interesting element of that game, or those two parts of that game, if you want to call it that way. I mean, from a writing perspective, this game puts a lot of effort into the actual plot and the actual characters, whereas 6 was a little bit more slapdash in that sense, where you kind of there wasn't a lot of character interaction where you're following someone, and there's a lot of like world state changes that end up unlocking this conversation with this other person. Ultima 7 is all about that, basically. Not all about that, but there's a good chunk of that in Ultima 7, where your interactions with characters, the way that you conduct yourself in the world, gives you new things to talk about with other people because of the events that have transpired, in the last X amount of time. Anyway, this is the first one that I'm trying deliberately not to spoil it because the plot is so interesting. It's one of those games where I do recommend people play it. And nowadays you can pick it up from like whatever for a couple of bucks. And there's even that there's an engine for it called Exalt that allows you to play both Part 1 and Part 2 with their DLCs. In a new engine that gets rid of some of the bugs and gets rid of some of the issues of playing it on like DOSBox or whatever. So, yeah, I mean that's kind of my presentation here on Ultima 7 Part 1 and 2. To summarize before we go, even shorter intros, right? Shorter but more flamboyant, more fantastic, more bombastic, right? We have voiced audio. We have an antagonist now, which we haven't had in a few games. And we have a complex plot that involves a lot of actual like puzzles that require you to piece together disparate sources of information to come up with a solution. We played around with the rules in the world, right? In 4, we had the establishment of the rules. In 5, we had the twisting of the rules. In 6, we kind of got away from the rules a little bit. The gargoyles have a set of virtues themselves that I didn't really talk about too much because I didn't really ever get that far in the game. But number 6 is more about what happens when the world changes and someone else needs to come into it. Ultima 7 is about about a world being the product of its rules, and the power of these kinds of philosophical rules, and how introducing a new set, or jamming a new set of rules into a world that used to operate on old rules, can create a lot of changes and a lot of interesting pressures in that world. So, from a writing perspective, ultra short intro. Everything you need is in-game. Lots of brain teasers, lots of character interactions. An actually more complex plot, which makes the games a little bit more interesting that way too. For as much of as there are flaws in the gameplay, people still remember these games as classics, and since that classicness comes from the writing, I feel like there's got to be something to pull from the writing itself. And since I haven't played it that much recently, I don't want to try to speak with too much authority about that. But you see where we're going. We've got a lot of mystery, a lot of interactions, a lot of if not detective work, at least like tracking a person kind of thing. Anyway, great games, great examples. We finally gone to an example of a game where not just the intro is an example of good writing, but like the whole game itself is an example of interesting and good writing. And as a someone who is talking about writing here, I feel like that's something worth noticing and maybe even getting back into. Anyway, we will cover Ultima 8 next time. Again, Ultima 8 is another one of those games that was just too hard for me as a little kid, so I have never actually finished it. But I know the plot to a certain degree, and we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll talk about Ultima 9, which is kind of like a dark sheep for a conclusion, but there are some real shining gems in Ultima 9 as well. So, anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. This is a lighter video than the one from yesterday, which involved integrals and math, but I don't know, I just felt like I had to do that and get that out of my system. So, anyway, next week we'll be talking about Ultima 8. I've got a couple of ideas for things to do also during next week as well for videos, but I don't have anything quite concrete yet, so we'll see how it goes. Anyway, have a good weekend, and I'll see you all later. Have a good one.